Battle for Azeroth, the latest World of Warcraft expansion, has been out for a few weeks now, and thus we've had a taste at the launch experience and the current build-up towards raiding, Mythic Plus dungeons, and the new PvP seasons. Now, people play MMOs for a plethora of different reasons, many of which aren't currently accessible in-game yet, but I want to discuss the potential that Battle for Azeroth has shown, and I do think it has shown a lot, in these launch weeks, and talk about where they've gone wrong and where I'd hope to see them go. Personally, I played Battle for Azeroth for a few weeks before it even came out in the closed beta, and right before launch I made the decision to essentially start completely fresh. A new server with only a few friends, viewers, and a completely new guild, meaning no heaps of gold to buy whatever I wanted. Of course, prior to that, we had already tasted some of BfA in the 8.0 patch, as a lot of the mechanical or balance changes were first introduced there. So let's take that as a starting point first of all, before I go into the reasons why I do think BfA is ultimately worth playing. One of the most controversial changes they made and we've had to play with for these few weeks are the move towards putting more abilities on the global cooldown, resulting in, yes, a slower pace of combat, a change most likely brought on by Blizzard's wish to reduce macro use, where you would combine powerful offensive buffs and trinkets together, an idea I do agree with on paper, but even at this stage I do think they went overboard. Luckily, I last minute decided to main a Demon Hunter, which have mostly been spared the wrath of global cooldowns, and that is definitely one of the reasons I made this last minute decision to begin with, as Infernal Strike being off the global cooldown feels so much better than, say, Warrior's Charge being on it, or Demon Spikes compared to the on GCD Ignore Pain or Druid's Bristling Fur talent. None of these defensive or mobility abilities feel right with an arbitrary waiting period, clunky in design to put it simply, less reactive and responsive. But the class purge didn't stop there. 8.0 of course took our artifacts away, which I am very happy about as we finally get weapon drops again. Well, in theory anyway, but with a few exceptions, such as Unholy Death Knight, this has left a lot of classes feeling underwhelming, as they had more abilities and passives to rely upon before. Battle for Azeroth then promised to create a similar level of secondary passives and mechanics through the introduction of the Heart of Azeroth system and the Azerite traits that are now present on every piece of helmet, chest, and shoulder gear. Unfortunately, I don't think they've remotely hit the mark there. Azerite gear is simply not very interesting. First of all, I think the UI could have easily been improved here by simply showing all of the potential traits in one window, as opposed to separate windows for every piece, but UI navigation is something BfA can improve upon to begin with, especially with those awful Tertolan world quests, but the actual traits are, for most classes, not very inspiring. There's a few that genuinely have some rotational changes, but for most of the DPS classes, it comes down to simply picking the generic neutral damage increases, as, say, Red Paladins, for instance, simply have nothing remotely interesting to pick from their own class pool. Or, as a Demon Hunter tank, my choice of trades comes down to basically two choices in the first row, and that's about that. Where in Legion we had artifact passives and legendaries that weren't perfect but in some cases offered genuine class-altering mechanics, Azerite traits tend to boil down to boring, slight secondary stat increases, or in worst cases actively lack synergy. As is the case for the Rejuvenation trait for Druids, where it does more if it's the only healing over time effect, which counteracts their Mastery passive that thrive on stacking them. Moreover, the difference in Heart of Azeroth level required feels rather baffling in certain situations. The traits you can pick on these Azerite pieces are all locked behind a specific Heart of Azeroth necklace level, but in a lot of cases you are already working towards the same traits, as there's simply not enough viable traits to actually pick between, but whereas one piece of 340 item level gear might require a level 17 Heart of Azeroth, the other might require a level 18 or even higher, despite that these are the same item level with the same stats. The traits are simply, by and large, uninspiring and feel insignificant and non-reactive. Now with that very mechanical discussion out of the way, let's talk about the actual leveling experience and the new zones that Battle for Azeroth introduces. First of all, the artists in BfA have done a stellar job. The music, the environmental design and detail, and all the new creature design is simply fantastic. I love the more downscaled, subtle fantasy elements that we've gotten in contrast to the near sci-fi, much more over-the-top design that Legion had. The Horde of course gets Zandalar, and the Alliance gets Kul Tiras. I do think there's an inherent imbalance between these two zones, each having 3 different leveling zones, as both on the beta and on live I believe Zandalar to be much superior in terms of actual questing experience, but nevertheless both are a breath of fresh air with much more open design compared to Legion's leveling zones. The Zandalari troll culture you experience with the various Loa, the new interesting troll characters, and the beautifully creative zones of Nazmir and Zuldazar especially make for a very joyous experience on the Horde side. Meanwhile, Alliance gets some very good Eastern European mythology in Drustvar with the weird witchcraft, or the British medieval navy themes with something darker lurking beneath the waves. The imbalance then comes from the fact that the Horde gets a very intimate story experience that links up in each zone, featuring new characters such as Talanji directly, whereas the Alliance zones feel less connected and feature fewer immediate interesting characters. As I still think it's an odd choice to have Jaina play such a background role thus far. Nevertheless, both islands are truly much more interesting to play through than what we've previously seen in Warlords of Draenor or Legion, and I think these zones are a real step up in creative design, even though a lot of the questing objectives sadly still boil down to generic grinding missions. And on that note, the return of day and night cycles and weather cycles is fantastic and better stay in-game forever. Moving back to the more mechanical, once you've reached 120 and have finished up the story zones, you'll of course revert back to completing world quests and dungeons, and there's a few oddities involved here that all have some interplay with one another. In my case, I hit 340 item level relatively fast, and I'm currently on 343 as I haven't really had much to upgrade with since. Now I went into Mythic 0 dungeons rather quickly, slightly below 310 as a tank, which meant I got 340 gear relatively fast out of the gate, but ideally, if you've just finished questing, you'll be around 280, 290, allowing you to do normal dungeons that drop 310 gear. This leaves things like elites and chests to be utterly pointless, as they don't even drop gear that compete with 120 questing gear. Ultimately, I don't see the point of their current implementation, as they have been a total waste of time to kill or collect during leveling and remain a total waste at max level. Why can't they at least drop eye level 300 gear, giving a fresh 120 character some incentive to scour for elites in between dungeon queues, for instance? Similarly, world quests scale with your item level and cap out at 325 for regular world quests, meaning by the time you get those 325 rewards, you probably already overgeared those, resulting in those being relatively pointless world quests and disappointing to have on your world map. They do of course still reward reputation, but the only use beside that is scrapping them in the hopes of getting some expulsum for crafting gear, just like elites. And professions in BfA have felt rather lackluster. They're a lot less tedious, as leveling them up goes fast and getting those rank up stars is now very easy with a few profession quests, but the actual rewards seem generally a little uninspired compared to Legion. Having maxed out leatherworking first, it's nice that I can grind the expulsum to make eye level 355 pants, but besides that, the only use I've gotten out of it is making discount heroism drums. Certainly straight after launch, trying to get some economic value out of profession gear seemed a no-go with how low the regular item level is. Another annoyance in regard to these systems is the random element involved in mission tables and emissary rewards. Emissaries are the biggest world quest reward granted upon completing 4 of a specific faction's world quests, and are sadly different between server regions and perhaps more annoyingly, factions. For instance, during 1 week the Horde got a 340 item level weapon in Europe, with weapons being probably the hardest thing to get, whereas the Alliance simply got some gold. Secondly, the mission table rewards being random means there's a very big discrepancy between how quickly people gain reputation, as some might luck out and get a lot of reputation missions for one type, whereas someone else might not at all. Personally, I don't see why these are random in nature to begin with, as they just put people on a different playing field when it comes to gearing up. That said, I much prefer how the mission table is integrated into Battle for Azeroth than how it was in Legion, with it gating entire story chapters back then, and in general feeling a lot less tedious now than it ever was back then. Regarding gating, the main element currently is the 7th Legion or honor-bound questline that is locked behind reputation and rewards an entire dungeon, King's Rest or Siege of Borealis, but the reputation grind itself is honestly not that big of a deal in BfA, and compared to, say, Suramar and Legion, is certainly a lot less work. Now, I mentioned Mythic 0 dungeons earlier, and in regard to those dungeons, I do think Battle for Azeroth has done an excellent job for the most part. The Underrot, Shrine of Storms, Siege of Borealis, Atoll d'Azar, all of these dungeons feel great, with a good balance of length, options and direction, and a clear design focus on making trash packs difficult, ostensibly with Mythic Plus in mind. Mythic 0 is rather easy. Even with a pickup group, I found little issue to run these very early on, but it's nice to run into hurdles in the form of trash mobs that need specific handling and double as a preemptive introduction into boss mechanics. Another new system introduced in BfA are the island expeditions, and although I think they have some potential on paper, their very design is inherently flawed. The reward from these are purely based on seeing your artifact power go up slightly, with a small chance at cosmetics, which isn't very engaging to begin with, but more to the point, the core mechanics undermine the potential the randomized elements have. Because every round is a rush towards farming Azerite as quickly as possible, which means trying to skip the unimportant mobs and grouping together those guarding Azerite veins or clustered around an elite, you don't really get much out of the randomized events to begin with. Inherent mob difference also isn't big enough for it to require a different response. Outside of the PvP versions, I find them rather dull and forgettable. And finally, I want to talk about what is probably my favorite element of Battle for Azeroth thus far and plays into the entire leveling and world questing experience, and that is War Mode and the new PvP scaling. I think War Mode needs more encouragement along the way, but it is a very good start into a new expansion. The option of turning PvP off entirely is a great choice for those that have zero interest in it, even though a lot don't seem to realize that perhaps that 10% isn't as mandatory as they think if they are just dying anyway. But if you do like to play with it on, having that 10% extra reward feels great, and more to the point, having those PvP talents makes a lot of classes feel a lot more enjoyable in questing than they have before. To the point where playing Havoc Demon Hunter without my PvP talents feels like such a step down, it's kind of silly. But the actual experience in War Mode has been great for me. I've certainly had some of it with friends and viewers, which skews the perception a little, but for the most part I've done this solo or formed groups with random players that just happen to be out in those zones, and have already spent hours in team-based PvP as a result that feels organic. The rewards they introduce with the Horde and Alliance Slayer, if you survive long enough with the bounty, are a fun mechanic, but I do think they need to do more in this regard, especially as they have an opportunity here to move this organic world PvP away from world quest areas with the introduction of more dynamic objectives. They already have the supply drops, not that I ever saw anything too rewarding come out of it, but I don't think these are enough. I'd like to see these become more frequent, become more rewarding, and see some other versions of this mechanic, such as, say, a convoy that moves across the map. This would allow Blizzard to naturally shift the world PvP away a little from world quest zones, making it slightly less frustrating for those playing completely on their own, while still retaining this reinvigorated world PvP experience. And because I feel it's worth mentioning, 8.0 also introduced account-wide honor, and this too has been nothing but an improvement in my opinion, as it makes spending time on alts in PvP just as worth it as on mains. So with that, I've gone over my opinions and criticisms of the Battle for Azeroth experience thus far. Personally, I'm quite positive about the experience. Overall, I think Battle for Azeroth has been one of the more enjoyable WoW expansion introductions as of yet, and I look forward to the first tier of raiding, Warfronts and Mythic Plus. Thank you for watching, my name has been Haas, and I'll see you in the next video or stream.
It's too far away.